a journalist spent 6 months interviewing people who claimed to have received miracles from the Virgin Mary. His goal? To prove that it was all nothing more than coincidence, psychology, or pure imagination. But during the last interview, something happened that he could never explain. But before we continue, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'd love to see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary are reaching. Michael Turner, 38 years old, investigative journalist in Boston. You know, that kind of person who has a rational explanation for absolutely everything, the kind who never accepts anything without questioning, checking, proving. Michael was exactly that type. His apartment was the perfect extension of his mind. Minimalist, organized, functional. No unnecessary decoration, no sentimentality. At the newsroom where he worked, Michael had a solid reputation, 16 years of career. Specialist in exposing corporate irregularities, financial schemes, political scandals, he was meticulous, relentless. If there was a lie, Michael would find it. But there was something few people knew about him. A locked drawer in his bedside table. Inside it, a photo he never hung on the wall, but could never throw away either. A woman smiling, brown hair in the wind, eyes full of life. Sarah. 12 years. It had been 12 years since the accident. Since Michael lost the only person he truly loved. Sarah was Catholic, devout. She went to Mass every Sunday, prayed the rosary before bed, had an unshakable faith in things Michael could never understand. They used to argue about it, not serious fights, but those conversations where one tries to convince the other. Michael with his rational arguments, Sarah with her serene faith. Their last conversation had been about that. Michael had been harsher than usual. Sarah had left the house a little upset. 4 hours later, the call from the hospital. Car accident. The other driver ran a red light at high speed. Sarah didn't stand a chance. Michael never entered a church again after the funeral. To him, if God existed, that wouldn't have happened. Simple as that. It was a Tuesday in March when Michael made the decision. He was at a cafe near the newsroom, laptop open, finishing an article about fraud in public bids. Beside him, 2 men were talking. One of them mentioned something about a miracle of the Virgin Mary and an unexplainable healing. Normally, Michael would have ignored it. But something that day made him pay attention. The man was telling a story about an acquaintance who had been declared incurable by doctors and, after a pilgrimage to a Marian shrine, made a full recovery. The doctors can't explain it, he said excitedly. Michael closed the laptop. An idea began to form in his mind. What if he investigated these so-called Marian miracles? It wouldn't be hard to find the flaws, the rational explanations, the coincidences that people mistook for divine intervention. That night, Michael began to research. There were hundreds of documented cases, people claiming miraculous healings, apparitions of the Virgin Mary, signs. Some famous, others obscure. He made a list. 15 cases spread across the country. Cases with available medical documentation, multiple witnesses. He would visit each one, interview the people, verify the facts, and prove methodically that miracles did not exist. You know when you start a project thinking it will be simple, and then realize it's far more complicated than you imagined? Michael spent the first 2 weeks organizing everything. He mapped the cases geographically to optimize travel, prepared standardized questionnaires, created a spreadsheet to categorize the rational explanations he would find. He was confident. He had a method. He had experience. He had truth on his side. In the 3rd week of March, he began his travels. The first case was in Atlanta, a woman who claimed to have been healed from a severe liver condition after a novena to the Virgin Mary. Michael arrived prepared. He had obtained access to her medical records, studied every detail before the interview. The woman, Linda Martinez, 52 years old, welcomed him into her home. Kind, warm. She told her story with simplicity. The severe condition, the doctors saying she would need a transplant, the family beginning to pray, the gradual and unexpected improvement. Michael asked his questions, checked dates, verified details. That night, in his hotel room, he wrote in his notebook, Case 1, medical remission, rare, but documented in the literature. Coincided with the period of prayer, creating a causal association in the patient's mind. Satisfied, he crossed the first case off his list. 14 to go. The second case was in Miami, a man whose brain problem had disappeared after months of prayer. Michael spent 3 days investigating, spoke with the doctors, analyzed MRI images, read studies on spontaneous remissions in oncological cases. Third case, fourth, fifth. Michael traveled from city to city, interviewed, checked facts, looked for the flaws in the stories, and he found explanations. He always found them, but have you ever had that feeling that you're trying to fit pieces that don't quite fit? They work, but only if you force them? Michael began to notice something around the 6th week. The rational explanations he found were plausible, possible, but they required an astonishing number of coincidences. The recoveries happened exactly during, or right after, the periods of intense prayer, not before, not long after, exactly during that specific time frame. He wrote down, coincidence. But the word was starting to sound empty. In the 7th case, in Chicago, Michael interviewed a family whose son had recovered from paralysis after an accident. The neurologists had diagnosed it as permanent, but gradually, over months of physiotherapy and prayer, movement returned. Michael spoke at length with the neurologist in charge. Is it atypical? Michael asked. Extremely, the doctor replied. In 30 years of practice, I've maybe seen 2 cases like this. The speed of his recovery was abnormal. Michael wrote that down. But that night, alone in his hotel room, he looked at his notes and realized he was using the same words over and over. Exceptional, atypical, rare, uncommon. Every case was an exception. Everyone was rare. When everything is an exception, is it still an exception? 11th week, 13th case. Michael was tired, more tired than he should have been. It wasn't the physical exhaustion from traveling. It was something deeper. He was in Philadelphia, interviewing an elderly couple. The husband had survived a hospital infection that resisted every antibiotic. The doctors had said it was only a matter of days. The family brought a blessed rosary from Lourdes. 72 hours later, the infection began to subside with no clear medical explanation. Michael asked all his usual questions, checked the hospital records. But when he returned to the hotel, he couldn't immediately write his conclusions. He sat on the bed, looked at the notebook full of notes, months of work, 13 cases investigated, and he realized something unsettling. He had explanations for everything, but proof of nothing. He could say statistical coincidence, but he couldn't prove it was coincidence. He could say spontaneous remission, but he couldn't explain why it happened at that specific moment. He could say neuroplasticity, but even the doctors admitted they didn't fully understand the case. That realization disturbed him more than he expected. 14th case, Boston, his own city. Michael had saved this one for last because it was nearby. He could investigate calmly without travel pressure. The case involved Margaret Sullivan, 67 years old, a widow living in a quiet residential neighborhood. Margaret claimed to have been healed from severe arthritis after months of praying to the Virgin Mary. Michael had the medical records. Rheumatoid arthritis, advanced stage, debilitating pain, conventional treatments with limited results, and then a significant and lasting improvement. 3 years later, no recurrence. Michael scheduled the interview for a Thursday afternoon. Margaret's house was simple, well cared for, a flower garden, fresh paint, a small statue of the Virgin Mary among the plants. She greeted him with a warm smile. "Please, come in. I made tea." Michael accepted, something he rarely did. He usually kept interviews strictly professional. But there was something about Margaret that made him feel at ease. They sat in the living room, hot tea, homemade cookies on the table. Margaret told her story without dramatization, the pain that kept her from doing simple tasks, the frustration with treatments that didn't work, the decision to start praying the rosary every day, even without being sure it would help. "I told myself if it doesn't help with the pain, at least it will give me peace to endure it," she explained. "And then?" Michael asked, taking notes. 3 months later, I noticed I could open jars again, small things like that. After 6 months, the pain had decreased significantly. The tests showed improvement. My doctor was surprised. "Must sneeze." What did he attribute it to? He said sometimes the body responds better than expected, but he also said he had never seen improvement like this in my kind of case. Michael wrote that down, asked more questions, checked dates, verified details. The story was consistent. The medical documents confirmed everything. After 40 minutes, he closed his notebook. "I think I have everything I need. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Sullivan." Margaret smiled. "Are you going to write about it?" Yes. "I'm investigating several similar cases." There was a pause. Margaret looked at him with those gentle, grandmotherly eyes. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you believe in any of the stories you've heard?" Michael hesitated. It was a question no one had asked him directly. "I believe the people are sincere," he answered carefully. "I believe they really improved, but miracles? I don't know." Margaret nodded, as if she understood perfectly. "Thank you for listening to me," she said. Michael left Margaret's house with a strange feeling. He couldn't identify what it was. Unease, perhaps. He drove back to his apartment in the quiet of early evening. Only one case was left, the 15th, the last on the list. But Michael decided he needed to write the article first, organize everything he had discovered, structure his conclusions. He got home. The apartment was dark, silent. He turned on only the desk lamp, opened his laptop, created a new document. Title: Investigating Marian Miracles. He stared at the blank screen. Where to begin? He started typing, "For 6 months, I investigated 14 cases of alleged Marian miracles. I spoke with doctors, verified hospital records, interviewed patients and relatives. The goal was simple, to find rational explanations for events people attributed to divine intervention." He stopped. "Reread?" Continued. "In every case, I found plausible explanations. Spontaneous remissions, atypical responses to treatments, neuroplasticity, psychological factors." He stopped again, looked at the screen. The words were correct. Factual. True. But something was wrong. Michael leaned back in the chair, rubbed his face with both hands. What was wrong? He had done everything right, investigated meticulously, found explanations, followed the scientific method. Then, why did he feel like he was lying? Michael shook his head, irritated with himself. No. He had evidence. Rational explanations. He had... What exactly did he have? Theories? Possibilities? Assumptions? Michael stared at the screen for a long moment, and then he sensed it. A smell, subtle at first, then stronger. Roses. Michael frowned, looked around. There were no flowers in the apartment. Never had been. The windows were closed. The scent grew more intense. Fresh roses. Impossible. Real. Michael stood from the chair, his heart beginning to race. "What?" he murmured. And then he saw, across the room, near the bookshelf, a figure, a woman dressed in blue. Michael froze completely. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't the product of exhaustion or imagination. It was a physical, real, solid presence. She was there, still, serene, looking directly at him. The deep blue dress seemed to capture light in an impossible way, the white mantle over her shoulders. And the eyes. The eyes of a mother who understands every pain, every doubt, every suffering. Michael couldn't move, couldn't speak, could hardly breathe. His mind tried to process, to explain, to rationalize. Hallucination, extreme fatigue, stress, psychological projection. But it wasn't. He knew it wasn't. The same way you know when you're awake versus when you're dreaming. The same way you know when something is real versus imagined. This was real. She was there, the Virgin Mary, in his apartment. Looking at him, Michael felt his legs weaken. He grabbed the chair to keep from falling. Tears began to stream down his face without him realizing it. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Because Michael understood everything in that gaze. He understood that she had been with Sarah, that there was something greater, something real, something that transcended his rational explanations, his scientific arguments, his need for proof. He understood that for 6 months he hadn't been investigating miracles. He had been running from believing them, because if miracles truly existed, then Sarah had been right. And if Sarah had been right, then he had wasted all this time being stubborn, proud, blind. Tears were falling freely now. Michael tried to speak, but couldn't. His throat was closed, his heart racing. The Virgin Mary remained there. 30 seconds, maybe a minute, maybe an eternity. Time lost all meaning. And then, as softly as she had appeared, she was gone. She simply wasn't there anymore. But the scent of roses remained. Michael fell to his knees on the floor, and for the first time in 12 years, since that terrible morning in the hospital when they said Sarah hadn't made it, Michael truly cried. Not the restrained kind of crying, not those silent tears you hide from others, but the cry that comes from a place so deep you didn't even know it existed. The cry of someone who carried a burden for so long he forgot he was carrying it. The cry of release. He stayed there on the floor of his apartment, crying like a child. He didn't know how much time had passed. It could have been minutes. It could have been an hour. When he finally managed to collect himself, he stood up slowly. The scent of roses was still in the air, fainter now, but still there. Michael looked at the spot where she had been, empty, but he knew it had happened. He knew it with the same certainty he knew his own name. He walked back to the table, to the still open laptop. He looked at what he had written. His hands trembled over the keyboard, and then he began to type again. He deleted everything he had written and started over. I saw, he paused, took a deep breath, continued. I spent 6 months investigating miracles of the Virgin Mary. I traveled across the country, interviewed dozens of people, checked every detail, searched for rational explanations for every case, and I found explanations, words that made sense, that sounded scientific, that allowed me to keep believing I was in control, that I understood everything, that the universe worked only by the rules I knew. But today she appeared to me. I can't prove it. I have no photo, no video, no witness. I have only my word. The word of a skeptical journalist who spent months trying to prove that miracles don't exist. And now I know they do. Because I saw the Virgin Mary in my apartment, standing there, real, present. And I understood something that all those people had tried to explain to me, but that I could never comprehend. Some things you only understand when they happen to you. You can have all the evidence in the world, all the rational arguments, all the scientific explanations. But when you see, you simply know. And I saw. So yes, I believe there is something greater than our understanding, greater than our science, greater than our explanations. Not because I stopped being rational, but because rationality has limits. And beyond those limits, there is something real, something I saw. Michael stopped writing. He looked at the text on the screen. And for the first time in 12 years, he smiled. A genuine smile, of relief, of peace. He saved the document, closed the laptop, and remained there, sitting in silence, in the apartment that still faintly smelled of roses. 3 weeks later, Michael was at the same cafe where it had all begun, same place, same table. But something was different. On his wrist, a simple bracelet, blue beads, a rosary that Margaret Sullivan had given him when he returned to thank her for the interview. Michael never published the article. He opened his laptop. He had a new story to write. He was back to his regular work, the kind of investigations he had always done. But now he did it differently, because he realized that the world was more complex than he had thought, that not everything fit neatly into simple categories of true or false, that there was room for mystery, for the unexplainable, for the sacred. As he worked, he touched the rosary on his wrist and whispered softly enough that no one could hear, "Thank you." "Wow, Mikey." Before finishing, I want to share something very special with you. We've just started our prayer community for the Virgin Mary, a space of faith and hope where people from all over the world unite to pray and share the graces they've received. If you feel in your heart the desire to be part of this prayer chain, click below. Become a member of the channel today and come pray with us. And look, if you've made it this far, to the end of Michael's story, do one thing for me. Write in the comments, "She was there." The words he never thought he would write. I want to see how many hearts this story truly reached. And every time I read that phrase in the comments, I'll know that one more person believes that the miracles of the Virgin Mary still happen. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to renew their hope today. May the Virgin Mary continue to bless and protect you and your family. Amen.